The man who came to Ellen Rourke's gate on that scorching August afternoon in 1882 looked like something the desert had already tried to swallow and spit back out. He was tall, or had been once. Now he walked with the particular stoop of a man whose hunger had grown heavy enough to bend him. His coat was the color of the New Mexico dust that clung to everything in the Pecos Valley, and his boots had seen so many miles of hard country that the leather had cracked open along the sides like the parched earth beneath his feet. He held onto the wooden gate post as though the post were the only thing keeping him upright, and perhaps it was, because when Ellen looked up from the vegetable garden where she had been wrestling with a stubborn stand of dry squash vines, the man's dark eyes met hers with an expression she recognized immediately. Not menace, not cunning, not the calculating look of the drifters who sometimes came through with their hands already reaching for something they hadn't been offered. No. What she saw in this man's eyes was simple, plain exhaustion, and underneath it, a kind of dignity that even destitution had not managed to strip away. "Ma'am," he said, and his voice came out rough, like a wagon wheel on gravel. "I don't mean to trouble you. I was only hoping you might spare some water. I've been walking since before first light, and the creek I was following dried up about 4 miles back." Ellen straightened up from the garden bed and pulled off her gloves. She was 31 years old, dark-haired, with a face that the Pecos sun had turned brown and fine-lined at the corners of the eyes. A face that showed every season she had worked this land alone. She had been a widow for 2 years now, ever since Thomas Rourke had been thrown from his horse during a spring roundup and broken his neck on the stony ground of the north pasture. She had buried him herself, with the help of old Miguel Delgado from the next homestead over, and she had kept the ranch running herself because there was simply no other choice. She studied the stranger for a long moment. He wasn't much older than she was. She judged perhaps 33 or 34, with dark hair that had gone wild under his battered hat, and a jaw covered in several days of dark stubble. His hands on the gate post were large and rope-calloused, the hands of a working man. "Water I can spare," she said plainly. "Come around to the well. There's a dipper hanging on the post." She watched him come through the gate carefully, making sure to latch it behind him, and something about that small gesture, the care he took to shut the gate even when he was clearly on the edge of collapse, made her relax the wariness she carried with her always, the wariness that was the necessary companion of a woman running a homestead alone. He drank 3 full dippers of water without stopping, and she did not comment on it, only pumped more from the well when the bucket ran low. When he finally stopped, he pressed the back of his hand against his mouth and looked at her with those exhausted dark eyes. "Thank you, ma'am. I'm obliged." "When did you last eat?" she asked, because she was a practical woman and what she saw in front of her was practical evidence of a man near to starving. He looked uncomfortable at the question, as though the asking of it landed somewhere sore. "Yesterday morning," he said. "I had some hardtack and a strip of jerky I'd been carrying since Roswell." "Roswell is 40 miles from here," she said. "I know it," he said quietly. Ellen looked back at her house, the low adobe structure Thomas had built in their first year of marriage, modest but solid, with the kitchen garden running along its south wall and the barn standing 20 yards east. She looked back at the man and made a decision the way she made most decisions these days, which was quickly and without a great deal of ceremony. "I have beans on the stove and cornbread from this morning," she said. "Sit on the porch. I'll bring it out." He started to protest. She could see it rising in him, that stubborn masculine reluctance to accept what looked like charity, and she cut it off before it could form. "It's not a hardship," she said. "I cook for one and I always make too much. Sit down before you fall down." He sat. His name, he told her when she brought the food out and settled into the other porch chair with a cup of coffee, was Cyrus Fairchild. He was from Georgia originally, had come west after the war, not the recent unpleasantness, he said carefully, but the big one, the war that had ended in 1865 and left half the country trying to figure out how to be something other than what it had been. He'd been 16 when it ended, too young to fight but old enough to watch his family's land go under the hammer when the debts came due. He had been drifting west in degrees ever since, picking up work where he could find it: cattle drives, fence building, mining camps, lumber operations up in the mountains. No one place ever stuck, he said, watching the beans disappear from the bowl with the controlled speed of a man who is very hungry but has enough pride left not to eat like an animal. I don't know if that's the land's fault or mine. What brought you to this corner of the territory? Ellen asked. He was quiet for a moment. Heard there was work near Fort Sumner. Turned out there wasn't, or at least not for a man who showed up without references and without a horse. He looked at his boots. I had a horse. Good one, actually. He threw a shoe outside of Santa Rosa and I couldn't afford the farrier, and one thing led to another and I ended up walking. Where are you headed now? Wherever there's work, he said simply. Ellen set down her coffee cup and looked out across her land. The late afternoon light was turning the dry grass gold, and in the distance the Pecos River was a dark thread against the pale landscape. The ranch was 320 acres, which had seemed like a fortune when Thomas had filed the claim, and which now seemed like a very large problem that she was managing to hold together through sheer stubbornness and not much else. The north fence line was down. It had been down for 3 weeks, since a storm had pushed through and taken out 2 full sections of post end rail along the creek boundary. 3 weeks of her cattle drifting in the wrong direction. 3 weeks of her riding out to push them back, 3 weeks of meaning to fix it, and not having the hands to do the work. Old Miguel had a bad back and could not help. The 2 ranch hands who had worked for Thomas' boys named Pete and Domingo had left after the first winter, gone to find steadier wages. She had managed without them, but managing without them meant some things simply did not get done. She looked at Cyrus Fairchild's calloused hands resting on his knees. She looked at the competent, careful way he had latched her gate. "Can you mend fence?" she asked. He looked up from his empty bowl. "Yes, ma'am," he said, and there was something that shifted in his expression, a small, cautious opening, like a door cracking an inch in a dark room. "I've built fence from Texas to Colorado, post and rail, wire, split timber. I have 3 sections down along the north boundary," Ellen said. "Posts, rails, and wire already stocked in the barn. I can pay $1 a day and your meals. It would take 2, maybe 3 days." He was quiet for a long moment, and in that silence Ellen heard every argument he might be having with himself about pride, about independence, about what it meant to accept work from a woman alone on a homestead. She waited because she had learned patience the way she had learned most things on this land, which was by having no alternative. "I'll take the work," he said at last. "Good," she said, and stood up to collect his bowl. "There's a bunk in the barn. It's clean. I keep it clean on principle, even when there's no one to sleep in it." "You're a very practical woman," he said, and it sounded like a compliment of the highest order. "I've had to be," she said, and went inside. That night, lying in the adobe house with the summer heat still rising from the walls, Ellen stared at the ceiling and thought about what she had just done. She had given a strange man food, water, a bunk, and wages. She had done it because the fence needed mending, and because something in his eyes had told her he was not dangerous, and she had learned to trust that particular instinct because in 2 years of being alone on this land it had not failed her. But she was also aware that she was a woman alone, and that awareness sat with her like a second heartbeat, low and constant. Still, the fence was down. The cattle needed containing. And Cyrus Fairchild had calloused hands and an honest face. She closed her eyes and let the desert night cool around her. In the morning she woke before light the way she always did, built up the fire, put on coffee and a pot of oats, and went out to feed the chickens and check on the milk cow. When she came back around the side of the house, Cyrus was already up, standing at the well, washing his face in the bucket with the focused attention of a man establishing his dignity for the day. He had run a razor over his jaw somewhere between yesterday's arrival and this morning. She noticed the scrape along his jaw was fresh, and that without the wild stubble he looked younger than she had thought. Younger, and she caught herself thinking, rather fine-featured in a sun-dark, hard-worked kind of way. "Coffee's ready," she said, looking away from that thought briskly. "Oats in 10 minutes. I'll show you the fence line after." "Yes, ma'am," he said. And there it was again, that careful, considered formality, the manners of a man who had been raised with them and held on to them through everything else he had lost. They ate breakfast on the porch together, mostly in silence, because both of them were morning people of the practical variety who saved their words for things that needed saying. Ellen noticed that he watched the land the way a man does when he is genuinely interested in it, not calculating its worth, but reading it, the way you read a face to understand its weather. He watched the way the light came over the eastern rim of the valley and turned the dust red. He watched her chickens scratching in the yard with a faint, private amusement. "Those are fine birds," he said. "They lay well," she said, "except in high summer. The heat puts them off." "Everything about this territory puts things off," he said, and there was something almost affectionate in the way he said it. They walked the fence line after breakfast. The damage was worse than she had described. The third section had not just lost its rails, but had 2 posts pulled clean out of the ground by the force of the water that had run through after the storm. Cyrus walked the full line without speaking, stopping to examine each break, testing the remaining posts with his hands, crouching to look at the soil depth. "You'll need to dig new post holes here and here," he said, pointing at the 2 bare spots. "Ground's rocky. It'll take time. But the rest is just rail and wire work, maybe half a day once the posts are in." "How long for the posts?" "Full day with the right tools. You have a post driver." "In the barn." "Then I'll start there." Ellen spent the morning on her own work. The vegetable garden needed watering from the irrigation channel she dug herself along the south wall, and the chickens needed their coop mucked out, and the milk cow needed attending to. She was busy every minute in the way that a single person running a working homestead is always busy, which is to say completely and without pause. But she found herself listening, without meaning to, for the sounds from the north fence, the ring of the post driver, the grunt of effort, the particular percussion of hard physical work being done well. At noon, she carried a pail of water and 2 wrapped cornbread sandwiches out to the north boundary. Cyrus had 1 hole dug and was halfway through the second, his coat hanging over a nearby fence post and his shirt dark with sweat. He drank the water and ate the sandwich standing up, looking at the work with the assessing eye of a craftsman. "You're making good progress," she said. "The second hole is hitting rock," he said. "I'll need to shift the placement about 6 inches east." "Is that all right with you?" "It'll hold just as well, maybe better." She looked at the spot he was indicating and thought about it. "That's fine," she said. He nodded, satisfied, and went back to work. That evening he washed up at the well again and came to the porch, where she had set out plates of salt pork and fried potatoes and sliced tomatoes from the garden. They ate with more ease than they had managed at breakfast, the silence between them settling into a more comfortable register. "Where did you learn fence building?" she asked. "Fellow named Asa Crawford out in the Texas Panhandle," Cyrus said. "He ran a big operation, fencing off grass the old-timers said should never be fenced. We put in 60 miles of wire in 1 summer, hot work, but Asa was a good teacher. He believed in doing a thing right or not at all." "That's a belief worth holding onto," Ellen said. "It is," Cyrus agreed. He looked at his hands. "I've held on to it through a good deal of things that didn't go right themselves." She refilled his coffee cup without asking if he wanted more, and he looked up from his hands and met her eyes, and for a moment something wordless passed between them. Not yet anything she could name, only a recognition, the particular flicker of 2 people who are of the same fundamental type. "How long have you been running this place alone?" he asked. She had not expected the directness of the question and found herself answering directly in return. 2 years. My husband Thomas was killed in a riding accident in April of '80. "I'm sorry," he said, and it was said simply, without the decorative sympathy that sometimes felt like its own kind of insult. "Thank you," she said, equally simply. It was hard at first. Then it became the way things were and you go on. Yes, he said, and the way he said it made her think there was something in his own history that he was agreeing with more than her specific words. She did not push at it. Not yet. It was only the first day. The second day he finished the post holes and set the new posts in place, tamping the soil and gravel around each one with meticulous care. Ellen came to check on the progress mid-morning and found him testing the set post by bracing against it with his full weight, rocking it, checking the give. "That's solid," she said. "It needs to be solid," he said. "A fence post done halfway is just a suggestion, and cattle don't pay much attention to suggestions." She laughed at that, a real laugh, not the polite acknowledgement she more often offered, and he looked at her with a faint, surprised pleasure, as though the sound of her laughing was something he had not quite expected and was unexpectedly glad of. The afternoon brought a different kind of work. He had moved to the rail and wire sections, and Ellen, having finished her morning chores earlier than usual, came out to hand up rails and hold wire steady while he worked. It was close, practical work, the kind that required occasional instruction. "Can you hold that end while I get the staple in?" And those small exchanges built a comfortable working rhythm between them that felt, she thought, like something she hadn't had in a long time. The simple ease of working alongside another person who knew what they were doing. "Tell me about Georgia," she said, while he hammered a staple into a post with 3 precise blows. He was quiet for a moment. "It was green," he said. "That's what I remember most about being a boy there. The green. Everything here is brown and gold and sometimes red, and I've come to love it, but when I first came west I missed the green something considerable." "Do you still miss it?" "Sometimes," he said. "But missing a place and wanting to go back are two different things. What wouldn't you want to go back to?" He set down the hammer and looked out across the valley, the way he had looked at her land that first morning reading it, not calculating it. "The war ruined that country in ways the grass grew back over but the people didn't," he said. "My father was a good man before the war. After, he was a different one. The land went, the money went, and something else went too that I don't have a name for." He picked up the hammer again. "I've been going forward since I was 18 years old. I don't much see the point of going the other direction." Ellen thought about that for the rest of the afternoon while they worked. She thought about what it meant to be a person who went forward, not because they had a destination, but because going forward was simply the only bearable direction. She thought she recognized that kind of person because she was one herself. By the time the sun was dropping toward the western hills, the fence was nearly done. 2 sections were fully repaired, and the third needed only the wire strung across the top rail, an hour's work in the morning. They walked back to the house in the long golden light, side by side, tired in the good way that comes from honest work. "You'll have this finished by midday tomorrow," she said. "Yes," he said, and then after a pause, "What happens after that?" She looked at him. He was looking straight ahead at the house and the barn and the kitchen garden going gold in the evening light. "I pay you what I owe and you go on to wherever you're going," she said, because that was the practical answer, the one that made sense. "Right," he said. "Of course." They ate dinner. She had made a proper beef stew, using some of the dried beef she kept in the root cellar, with potatoes and onions from the garden. And the conversation at the table was easier than it had been the night before, flowing from one thing to the next with a naturalness that surprised her. He told her about the cattle drive he'd worked in '79, from the Texas Panhandle up through Indian Territory to the Kansas railheads. She told him about the first winter she'd spent in New Mexico, when the cold had been savage, and she and Thomas had burned through their wood supply by February, and had pulled apart an old outbuilding just to keep the fire going. "You were not a woman who gave up easily even then," he said. "I have never given up easily in my life," she said. "It's not a choice I seem to be able to make." He smiled at that, a full smile, the first full one she had seen from him, and it changed his face entirely, made it warmer and younger and something that she had to look away from. She was not a woman who let herself be foolish about men. She had loved Thomas and lost him, and the landscape of grief had reshaped her considerably. But she was also 31, not dead, and she was sitting across a dinner table from a man who smiled like that, and she was human. She cleared the plates and they said good night with the careful courtesy of two people who are managing something neither of them is quite ready to name. She lay awake longer that night. The third morning she was at the fence line before he was, having risen earlier than usual and gone straight out to check on her cattle in the north pasture. She was already assessing the last section when she heard his boots on the dry ground behind her. "You could have waited," he said. "I was already up," she said. He took up the wire and the staple pliers without further comment, and they worked the last section together. A single strand of wire along the top and a second along the middle rail, and she held the wire taut while he drove the staples, and their hands came close but did not touch. Not quite. There was a moment where her fingers were 3 inches from his on the wire, and she was aware of those 3 inches with a precision that she found somewhat annoying. By mid-morning it was done. She walked the whole line herself, testing each post, checking the tension in the wire, looking at the joints on the new rails. It was good work. It was, in fact, excellent work, careful and solid and done with the kind of pride that comes from a man who believes, as that long-ago rancher Asa Crawford had apparently taught him, in doing a thing right or not at all. "It's good work," she said. "Very good work." "Thank you," he said. She paid him $3 from the small tin she kept in the kitchen, laid out on the porch table in silver coins. He picked it up and held it in his fist and was quiet for a moment, and she could see him recalibrating. He had come to her gate on the edge of collapse 2 days ago, and now he had $3 and a direction to go in, and that should have been the end of it. "The other fences on the property," she said, because she was looking at the list she kept in her head and could not help herself. "The south line needs repair work before the fall, 2 sections at least, and the east boundary has a gate hinge that's pulled loose from the post. It's been dragging all summer." He looked at her. She looked at him. "I am not asking you to stay out of charity," she said. "I'm asking you because the work exists and you can do it, and I can't pay a real ranch hand's wage, but I can pay your meals and $1 a day, and the bunk in the barn is dry and clean." He turned the 3 silver dollars over in his palm, one by one. "You need more than fencing done," he said quietly. "I saw the barn roof. The southeast corner of it is letting in light." "The barn roof has been on my list for 6 months," she said. "The corral gate post is rotting at the base," he continued, "and one of your irrigation channel banks is breaking down on the west side. I saw it this morning." "All of those things are on the list," she said. He looked up from his palm and met her eyes, and there was something in his expression that she could only describe as a careful, almost shy hope, a thing so unguarded on his strong, weathered face that she felt it like a change in air pressure. "I could stay," he said, "if it's useful." "It would be useful," she said. "Then I'll stay," he said simply, as though it were the easiest thing in the world, and perhaps for both of them it was in that moment because neither of them was looking past the moment very far. He did not leave the next day or the day after that. The weeks that followed were a revelation in the particular variety of happiness that comes from hard shared work. He fixed the barn roof, a 2-day job of replacing the rotted shake shingles along the southeast corner, and repaired the corral gate and rebuilt the irrigation bank, and moved methodically through every item on Ellen's mental list, which was, she admitted to herself, considerably longer than the 5 or 6 items she had mentioned. He had the particular gift of seeing what needed doing before being told. She would come out in the morning and find that the loose wheel on the water wagon had been tightened, or that the hen that had been getting out through a gap in the coop fence had been gently thwarted by a patch of wire. He never made a production of these things. He simply did them. In return, she fed him well. She was a good cook, practical and not fancy, but nourishing beans and salt pork and cornbread, yes, but also the tortillas she'd learned from Senora Delgado next door, and the occasional roast chicken, and the sourdough bread she baked every Friday. the smell of which she noticed made him stop whatever he was doing outside and lift his head like a man experiencing something close to happiness. They talked more as the weeks wore on. After supper on the evenings when the heat had broken a little, they would sit on the porch in the two wooden chairs that faced the valley and the western light, and they would talk about things small and large in the easy way of two people who have found in each other an unexpected but welcome fit. He told her more about his life, in pieces, the way people tell difficult histories, giving a bit, waiting to see if it was received all right, then giving a bit more. The father who had drunk himself to ruin after the war. The years of drifting, first odd jobs in Georgia, then a river journey west, then Texas, then the long, slow migration up through the territory. The cattle drives and the mining camps and the winter he'd spent in a Colorado lumber camp so cold that his fingers had stayed numb for a month afterward. "Haven't you ever wanted a place of your own?" she asked him one evening, and it was a more significant question than it might have appeared, and both of them knew it. He was quiet for a long time, looking at the stars coming out over the Pecos. "I've wanted it," he said. "I've wanted it more times than I can count. But wanting and having are different propositions, and for a long time I didn't think I was the kind of person who got to have things. I don't know how to explain that. I think I understand it," she said. Though from the other direction, I always had the thing, the land, the house, the life, and then it was taken and I had to learn how to keep it alone. Sometimes I wonder if holding on is easier or harder than reaching for. He turned his head and looked at her, and in the blue summer dusk his face was very still. "You've held on hard," he said. "This place shows it." "It shows a lot of broken things," she said dryly. "It shows that you fought for every inch of it," he said. "That's not broken. That's proof." She looked down at her coffee cup. There was a warmth in her chest that she did not immediately try to name or manage. September came, bringing with it the slight easing of the heat and the beginning of the long, slow shift of the desert into its fall colors, the grass going deeper gold, the cottonwoods along the creek starting their annual yellow turning. The cattle were fat and doing well, now that the fences were sound and Ellen had more time to manage the herd rather than constantly chasing its perimeter breaks. She had 12 head she was planning to sell at the fall market in Roswell, and the price on beef had been decent this year. Cyrus had started helping with the cattle work as well, naturally and without any explicit discussion of it. He understood cattle, having spent years on drives, and she found his presence on the early morning checks both useful and something else, something she had stopped pretending not to notice. One afternoon they were working together in the corral, sorting the steers she intended to sell from the breeding stock she would keep through winter. It was hot, dusty, skilled work, and they moved through it with the coordination of people who have learned each other's rhythms. She going left, he going right, the cattle moving between them in the orderly way that comes from two people who know what they're doing. When the last steer was in the holding pen and the gate was latched, she pushed her hat back and wiped her forehead and found him looking at her with an expression she had not seen from him before, not the quiet warmth she had grown accustomed to, but something more direct, something that he seemed to be allowing himself for the first time. "Ellen," he said, just her name. Nothing before it, nothing after. She waited. He took his hat off and held it in both hands, which she had noticed was what he did when he was about to say something he wasn't sure of. "I've been here 6 weeks, he said. 7, she said. 7 weeks, he said. And I want to say something and I'm not sure I have the right to say it." "You can say anything you need to say," she said. Her heart was doing something undignified, but her face was steady. "I don't want to leave," he said. "That's the honest truth of it. I don't want to go on to somewhere else and pick up the next piece of work and keep moving. I've been moving for 15 years, Ellen, and I'm tired of it, and He stopped. He turned his hat in his hands. "And I have feelings for you that are not the feelings a hired hand ought to have for the woman who employs him, and I'm aware that I arrived at your gate with nothing to recommend me except willingness to work, and I'm not asking you for anything that you don't want to give, but I needed you to know it before I lost the nerve to say it." The corral was very quiet in the afternoon heat. Somewhere above them, a hawk was circling on an updraft. One of the steers nosed at the fence rail. Ellen looked at Cyrus Fairchild, this man she had fed water and food and offered a bunk and $3, and then more days of work because she had not wanted him to go, though she had not quite admitted that to herself until this very moment. She looked at his calloused hands holding his hat. She looked at his honest face, brown and weathered and hoping. "You came to my gate on your last legs," she said, "and you mended my fence and my barn roof and my corral gate and my irrigation bank, and you have been the most useful and decent presence this ranch has seen in 2 years." She paused. "And I have feelings for you that are not the feelings a woman ought to have for a man she hired off desperation and charity, and I have been lying to myself about it for at least 5 of these 7 weeks. He went very still. "I'm not a young woman with a young woman's ideas about romance," she said. "I'm a practical woman who has worked hard for everything she has, and I will not be foolish with my heart or with this land. But I am also a woman, and I am not going to pretend otherwise." She looked at him steadily. "I would like very much for you to stay, Cyrus, not as a hired hand." He was quiet for so long that she nearly reached for the armor of practicality again. Then he crossed the distance between them in 3 steps, and he was close enough that she could see the exact color of his eyes, which were the dark brown of deep river water, and he lifted a hand and touched the side of her face with the back of his fingers, gently, carefully, the way he did everything, and she felt the roughness of his calloused skin against her cheek and stood very still for it. "Not as a hired hand," he said. "Not as a hired hand," she agreed. He kissed her then, carefully and thoroughly, and the hawk kept circling overhead, and the afternoon sun pressed down on them both, and the Pecos Valley spread out all around them in its dusk-gold autumn beauty, and Ellen Rourke thought that the world, on its worst days and its best ones, was a more surprising place than you could ever fully account for. What followed was the kind of courtship that happens between 2 adults who have both learned to value honesty over decoration. They were not giddy children. They were people in their 30s who had already been shaped and scarred by life, and who knew the difference between infatuation and the deeper, quieter thing that builds itself out of shared work and shared laughter, and the particular intimacy of seeing a person move through their daily life and liking what you see. They were careful with each other in the way of people who have both been hurt, careful and also increasingly open, the way a window opens a little wider as the morning warms. He moved from the barn bunk into the main house, a transition that was managed with the practical simplicity characteristic of them both, with a conversation that lasted perhaps 20 minutes and resulted in his few possessions being carried from the barn to the second bedroom, which had been Thomas's storage room since Ellen had found she could not sleep in the room they'd shared after his death. Old Miguel Delgado came over from the neighboring homestead one afternoon not long after, and sat on the porch, and drank coffee and observed Cyrus Fairchild with the particular thoroughness of an old man who has seen much of the world and knows what to look for. Cyrus was respectful and direct with him, and after Miguel left that evening he told Ellen, with the satisfied certainty of a man who has made his judgment, "He is a good man. He will stay." "I hope so," Ellen said. "He will stay," Miguel repeated, with the confidence of someone who was not hoping but knowing. Toward the end of October, Ellen rode to Roswell to sell her 12 steers at the fall market, and Cyrus rode beside her on the horse she'd lent him, a steady roan gelding named Coleman, who had been Thomas's horse, and who had taken to Cyrus with a lack of hesitation that Ellen found, privately, somewhat meaningful. The drive took 2 days, camping one night beside the river, and those 2 days in the open country with the October sky vast and blue above them, and the cattle moving quietly ahead and the nights cool, and the fire good. Those 2 days were among the finest she could remember in a long time. They talked about things they hadn't talked about yet. She told him about her childhood in Missouri, about her father who had been a school teacher and her mother who had been the most competent person she had ever known, who had died of fever when Ellen was 14 and left a hole in the family that no one had ever quite filled. She told him about meeting Thomas at 23, about the decision to come west, about the years of building the ranch from nothing. He told her about things he had not told anyone in a long time, about the brother he had lost in a mining accident in Colorado in '77, a loss that he still carried the way you carry something very heavy that you have learned to carry efficiently but cannot put down. His brother's name had been William, and William had been the better half of the two of them, funnier and kinder, and losing him had been what had finally stripped the last attachment Cyrus had to the idea of going east again. "William would have liked you," he said, watching the fire. "He liked people who didn't waste words." "I'm sorry about William," she said. "I'm glad I told you about him," he said, which was its own kind of answer. The cattle sold well. She got $38 for the 12 steers, a good price, one that would see her through the winter with money to spare for the spring improvements she had been planning. She settled the money carefully in the tin she kept inside her coat, and when they rode out of Roswell with the empty lead ropes trailing behind them, she felt lighter than she had in months. "Good price," Cyrus said. "Very good price," she agreed. "The buyer said beef will stay strong through winter. That's promising for spring." "What are you thinking for spring?" he asked, and the question was one of genuine partnership, not politeness. And she answered it the same way, talking about the ideas she had been carrying for a year and had had no one to talk through: expanding the breeding herd, repairing the south pasture water trough, possibly trying a kitchen garden expansion with proper irrigation. He listened and thought and offered his own ideas, and by the time they made camp for the second night, they had the rough outline of a spring plan that was better than either of them would have made alone. They arrived home to the ranch on the third day, and the house and the barn and the fences standing against the autumn sky looked to her like something she had fought for and kept and was now sharing, which was its own kind of new thing. That night he came to her doorway and stood there with the lamplight behind him and said, quietly, "I want to do this right, if you're willing." She looked at him for a moment. "What does doing this right look like to you?" "It looks like asking you to marry me," he said, simply and without the kind of ceremony that might have made it feel smaller rather than larger. "If that's something you want." Ellen Rourke had been proposed to once before, by Thomas Rourke on a Missouri porch 23 years ago in a spring evening, and she had said yes easily and happily, because she had loved him, and because the world had been simpler then in the way that a young person's world is always simpler. She was not that young woman now. She was a woman who had loved and lost and rebuilt and held on and was holding still. She looked at Cyrus Fairchild, this man who had come to her gate with nothing and had given her, over the weeks since, a quality of presence and care and partnership that she had not expected and would not now give back. "Yes," she said, "that is something I want." They were married in December in the little church in the town of Picacho, 12 miles north, on a day so cold and clear that the sky looked polished. Miguel Delgado came, leaning on his cane, and his wife Consuelo came with him, and the minister's wife and one of the neighboring homesteaders, a woman named Harriet Babcock, who had been mildly suspicious of Cyrus until the previous month, when he had spent an entire afternoon helping her husband fix a wagon axle and had refused any payment. After that she had decided he was acceptable. Ellen wore her best dress, the green wool one she had been saving for occasions, and Cyrus had bought himself a new shirt in Roswell the month before, planning ahead, she realized, with a warmth that spread through her chest. He looked at her when she came up the aisle of the small church. There were only 10 people in the pews, with an expression of such plain and uncomplicated happiness that she had to look straight back at him to keep from embarrassing herself by crying. "I, Cyrus Fairchild," he said, and his voice was steady, "take thee, Ellen Rourke, to be my wedded wife." She said the same words back to him and meant every one. Afterward, Consuelo Delgado had made tamales for the small gathering in the church fellowship room, and Miguel had produced a bottle of whiskey from somewhere inside his coat, and Harriet Babcock had brought a dried apple cake, that was better than anything you might expect from a December in the Pecos Valley. And they celebrated in the warm, simple way of frontier people, well-fed and good-humored and grateful for what was. Cyrus sat beside her at the long table, and his hand found hers under the table and held it, and she turned her hand over and held his back, and neither of them mentioned it to anyone, but both of them carried it for the rest of the afternoon like a private, particular warmth. They drove home in the wagon in the blue winter dusk, wrapped in blankets, the horse blowing steam into the cold air. The valley was silver and still around them, and the stars were beginning to come out over the eastern mountains, and she leaned against his shoulder without deciding to, simply because it was there, and because it was warm and because it was his. "Well," he said. "Well," she agreed. "I reckon this is the best thing that's happened to me," he said, "in as long as I can clearly remember." "Me too," she said, "and I have a very good memory." He laughed and put his arm around her, and they drove through the cold desert night toward their home. Winter on the Pecos was a contained indoor season, full of the particular intimacy of two people learning to inhabit a shared space. Ellen had lived alone long enough that she had strong opinions about where things went and how the morning routine should flow, and Cyrus had lived on the move long enough that he was genuinely unconcerned about most domestic arrangements, willing to adapt to whatever system was already in place. This turned out to be a highly successful combination. What she discovered about him in those winter months was the texture of his daily self, the way he was cheerful in the mornings, energetically so, which counterbalanced her own morning quietness pleasantly. The way he read, carefully and with clear enjoyment, the newspapers she subscribed to from Santa Fe, and would sometimes read her passages he found interesting, editorials about the cattle industry or the politics of the territory or the expanding railroad. The way he fixed things not only when they broke but in anticipation of their breaking, a kind of careful stewardship that she recognized and valued because it matched her own. She learned that he carried a slight sadness sometimes, visible in the evenings when something reminded him of William, and she learned to sit with him in those moments without trying to fix them, which was the right response and which he noticed and was grateful for. She learned that he had a dry humor that emerged most reliably when he was comfortable, and that making him laugh was one of the more satisfying things she had discovered about her own abilities. He learned her, in return. He learned that she was fiercely independent in ways that sometimes manifested as refusing help even when she needed it, and he learned to offer help in ways that didn't trigger that independence, not, "let me do that," but "let me give you a hand with that," a distinction that mattered to her, and that he figured out by observation and held to consistently. He learned that she grieved Thomas still, quietly and privately, and that her grief was not an obstacle between them but a room in the house of her that he simply respected and did not try to enter or rearrange. One cold January evening they were sitting by the fire after supper, she with her mending and he with a newspaper, when he folded the paper and looked at her with a thoughtful expression. "There's a property for sale," he said, 60 acres east of here on the far side of the creek. Old Hector Muniz is selling it. He's moving his family to Las Cruces. It would give us access to the spring-fed water on that east side." She looked up from her mending. "How much is he asking?" $40. "Maybe less if we negotiated." She thought about it. Between the cattle sale money and her winter savings and the $3 Cyrus had arrived with that had since grown considerably thanks to his wages, which she had continued to pay into a separate tin, because it mattered to her that they each had something of their own, the $40 was possible. "What would we do with it?" she asked. "Run more cattle," he said. "The spring water means we could graze a larger herd through summer without depending entirely on the river. And there's good grass on the east side. I've ridden through it. With some management it could be productive." She turned the idea over. "Let's talk to Hector," she said. They bought the 60 acres in February for $35 after a neighborly negotiation conducted over Consuelo Delgado's kitchen table, with Miguel translating at points where Hector's English and Cyrus's limited Spanish left gaps. The transaction was recorded at the county land office in Lincoln, and when she walked out with the deed in her hands, 380 acres now, Ellen and Cyrus Fairchild, joint owners, it said in the county recorder's clear script, she felt something shift in her chest that she could only describe as rightness. Cyrus was looking at the deed over her shoulder and she could feel him smiling. "Ours," he said, quiet and certain. "Ours," she said, and liked the sound of it very much. Spring came the way it always came in the Pecos Valley, not gently but all at once, 1 week still cold, and then 3 warm days in a row, and then suddenly the cottonwoods along the creek going green and the desert blooming with the brief, stunning color of the prickly pear and the sage, and the air carrying the particular scent of warmed earth after cold that was, to Ellen, one of the most moving smells in the world. With the additional land came additional work, and the spring was busy in the way that she had always known springs to be on a working ranch. Fencing the new boundaries, improving the water access, buying 6 additional head of young cattle to build the herd, repairing what the winter had undone on the original property. They hired young Tomás Delgado Miguel and Consuelo's 18-year-old grandson, who had been looking for work since the winter, on a seasonal basis, and Tomás turned out to be a capable and cheerful presence, good with the cattle and eager to learn whatever Cyrus was willing to teach him. Watching Cyrus with Tomás, patient and thorough and genuinely invested in the boy's development, showed Ellen another side of him she hadn't seen before, a natural teacher, a man who liked to pass on what he knew. "You'd have made a good father," she told him one evening after Tomás had gone home. He looked at her very quietly. "That's a thought I've had," he said. She held his gaze. "I've had it too," she said. They were both quiet for a moment in which quite a lot was said without any words at all. "I'm 33 years old," she said. "There's still time, but not an unlimited amount of it." "I know," he said. "I want to," she said. "If you want to." "I want to," he said. By August, exactly 1 year after he had first come to her gate, though neither of them mentioned the anniversary explicitly, Ellen was fairly certain she was expecting a child. She confirmed it in the quiet way of frontier women, who relied on their own bodies' evidence, and the knowledge passed between women in the territory, and she told Cyrus on a Saturday morning over breakfast with the same directness she applied to everything important. "I believe I'm going to have a baby in the spring," she said. He put down his coffee cup very carefully, the way you put something down when you're afraid your hands might shake. "Are you sure?" he said. "Sure enough to say it to you," she said. He stood up from the table and came around to her side and crouched down in front of her chair and took both her hands in both of his and looked at her with his river-brown eyes and said nothing for a moment, just looked at her, and she felt the full weight of what they had built together in the past year and were about to extend further. "I am very happy," he said at last. "I am too," she said. "I am very, very happy." He pressed his lips to her hands, both of them, and she felt his exhale against her skin, slow and deep and full. The pregnancy changed the ranch's rhythm in small, practical ways. Ellen was, as she had warned him she would be, not a woman who took to being coddled. She continued her work through the fall with minor adjustments, handing off the heavier lifting to Cyrus and Tomás, while maintaining her full engagement in the management, decision-making, and the cattle work that didn't require heavy lifting. Cyrus navigated the balance between concern and respect for her autonomy with a care that she noticed and appreciated, worried when he had reason to worry and stepping back when she told him she was fine. The fall cattle sale in Roswell went exceptionally well that year. The expanded herd meant she sold 18 head, and the price was strong, and they came home with nearly $60 that went into the ranch fund and began to feel like the foundation of something genuinely solid. On the way home from Roswell, camping by the same river bend where they had camped the year before, she lay on her side with the blanket pulled up and his hand warm on her rounded stomach, and she looked at the fire and thought about the year that had passed. "Do you know what I was thinking?" she said, "when you were standing at my gate a year ago." "You were thinking whether I was going to be trouble," he said. "I was thinking that you had honest eyes," she said. "I was thinking that whatever else was uncertain about you, your eyes were honest." "That's a generous reading," he said. "I'm a good judge," she said. He moved closer to her, careful of the baby, and she felt his warmth at her back and his breath in her hair. And the fire burned down toward coals, and the desert night was cold and clean, and the stars were extraordinary. And she thought that she was happier than she had any right to expect and grateful for every specific thing that had led to this moment, including the broken fence and the dried-up creek, and a man who had known to latch the gate behind him. The baby came in March, as predicted, a boy, as it turned out, though she had had no particular prediction about that either way. The birth was attended by Consuelo Delgado, who had delivered half the babies in the Pecos Valley over the past 30 years, and who was as calm and competent in a birth room as anyone Ellen had ever seen. Cyrus spent the hours of labor in a state of controlled anxiety that he managed by doing every useful thing within reach, building up the fire, heating water, staying close enough that she could call for him, and far enough that Consuelo had room to work. When Consuelo put the baby in his arms for the first time, Cyrus Fairchild stood in the lamplight of their bedroom and looked down at his son with an expression that Ellen would carry with her for the rest of her life, something so open and overwhelmed and purely joyful that it was almost difficult to look at directly. "Hello," he said to the baby, very quietly, as though introducing himself to someone important. The baby, red-faced and newly arrived and indifferent to formality, made a small, determined sound. They named him William Thomas Fairchild, William for Cyrus's lost brother, Thomas for the man whose land and labor had made the ranch possible. It was Ellen's idea, and when she suggested it, Cyrus had been quiet for a long moment and then had looked at her with the particular expression he had when she did something that moved him more than he was ready for. "That's right," he said. "That's exactly right." William Thomas Fairchild was a healthy, loud, and opinionated baby who made his preferences known with great energy and who calmed reliably whenever Cyrus held him against his chest and walked. This became an established practice, Cyrus walking the baby in the blue early mornings while Ellen slept an extra precious hour, walking him slowly around the main room or, on mild enough mornings, out onto the porch to see the dawn come up over the valley. Ellen would wake to hear the baby quiet and Cyrus's low voice murmuring something, sometimes a story, sometimes just a description of what he could see from the porch, the river and the grass and the distant mountains. She would lie in the warmth of the bed and listen to the sound of his voice through the adobe wall and feel a happiness so complete it had an almost physical weight. The summer of 1884 was a good one. The grass was strong, the cattle were healthy, and the expanded herd had grown to the point where Tomás came on full time and they hired a second seasonal hand, a quiet man named Aurelio Vasquez who knew cattle better than he knew anything else and who fit into the operation smoothly. The ranch was now, Ellen thought, a real thing, not just a holding on but a genuine enterprise, the kind that had a future past one person's stubbornness. She and Cyrus had fallen into the partnership of marriage so completely that it was sometimes difficult to remember the ranch as it had been before, though she remembered it, and she kept that memory as a form of respect for what she had managed alone. She had run this land by herself for 2 years, and she had been capable of continuing to run it. Cyrus had not saved her. He had joined her, which was an entirely different thing, and the distinction mattered to her and to the way they operated together. They argued sometimes, because they were both people with strong opinions and the confidence to voice them. The arguments were generally about practical matters, how to allocate funds, whether to sell certain cattle now or wait for a better price, the question of whether to try planting a small grain crop on the east parcel. The arguments were the productive kind, the ones that ended in decisions that were better than either position had been at the start, because both of them were more interested in getting to the right answer than in being the one who had been right. Once in early fall, They had an argument of a different kind, one that touched closer. It had started with a conversation about a drifter who had come by the property looking for work. A young man who reminded Ellen, somewhat painfully, of how Cyrus had looked at her gate 2 years before. Cyrus had offered him 2 days' work on a drainage project, and Ellen had been grateful for it. And then something in the interaction had brought up, in both of them, the particular vulnerability of that memory, him arriving with nothing, her alone and responsible for everything. And the argument that followed was not really about the drifter at all, but about fear, and about what they had each been afraid of, and about the specific and somewhat frightening thing it is to love someone you needed. They talked it out on the porch in the dark, voices low so as not to wake William, who was sleeping inside. It took a long time and was not easy. But by the end of it, something had deepened between them in the way that things deepen when you go through them honestly instead of around them. "I'm not going anywhere," he said toward the end. "I know," she said. "I know that, but knowing and feeling are different propositions." "Yes," he said, "they are." She took his hand in the dark. "I'm glad you stayed," she said. "Every day I'm glad you stayed." "I'm glad you asked me about the fence," he said. She laughed at that, and he laughed too, and William made a small sound inside the house that suggested he might be waking up, and Cyrus stood and said he would check. And she sat on the porch in the September night and looked at her land and her life, and felt the deep, settled gratitude of a person who has learned to recognize what she has. The railroad came through the territory in 1885, changing everything the way the railroad always changed everything. The nearest line was still 40 miles north, but it meant the cattle market opened up considerably, prices rose, access improved, and the calculation of what to do with a working ranch shifted in ways that were interesting to think about. Cyrus and Ellen spent a long evening in October going over their situation. The ranch was producing well. They had a solid herd. They had 2 good hands. They had the additional land on the east side. With access to the railroad market, the question of expansion became real rather than theoretical. "I think we could reasonably double the breeding herd over 3 years, Cyrus said, working a pencil over the edge of the newspaper because they didn't have the paper to waste on calculations. "It would mean a tighter winter, but if we manage the grass right and the water holds, the spring on the east parcel," Ellen said. "That's the key. If we put in a proper trough system from that spring, we're not dependent on the river in a dry year." "That's 2 weeks of work in the spring," he said. 2 weeks in spring to be water secure through summer," she said. "I'll take that trade." He wrote down numbers and she looked over his shoulder, and they went back and forth for another hour. And at the end of it they had a plan that felt ambitious but not reckless, which was, Ellen thought, the correct quality to aim for. In November, Miguel Delgado died quietly in his sleep, which was the good death for a man who had worked hard all his life and deserved one. Consuelo was bereft but steady, in the way of a woman who has built her steadiness into the structure of who she is. Ellen went to the funeral and sat beside Consuelo and held her hand, and Cyrus dug the grave because that was the kind of man he was, and they brought food after the service and stayed through the afternoon. Walking back to the wagon in the cold November evening, Cyrus was quiet in the particular way that meant he was thinking about William, his brother William, not the baby. And Ellen reached for his hand without comment and held it until they reached the wagon. "He was a good man, Miguel," Cyrus said at last. "He was a very good man," Ellen agreed. "He told me the first week you were here that you would stay." Cyrus looked at her. "He said that. He said it twice. Very certain." "Smart man," Cyrus said. "Extremely smart man," Ellen said. The spring of 1885 brought the trough project 3 weeks, as it turned out, not 2, but well worth it. They brought water from the East Spring in a system of channels and wooden troughs that Cyrus designed with the same careful thoroughness he applied to everything. Tomás and Aurelio helped dig, and by the end of April the East pasture had reliable water that did not depend on the river, and the relief of that security was considerable. It also brought, in May, the discovery that Ellen was expecting again. "I was wondering," Cyrus said when she told him, with the same careful, deliberate happiness he had shown the first time. "Were you hoping?" she asked. "I was hoping," he said. "William needs company." "William is very loud company for himself," she said. "I'm not sure he needs help." Cyrus laughed and picked her up, and she let him, laughing too, and from the corner of the room where he had been conducting some complex business with 2 wooden spoons and a tin cup, 14-month-old William Fairchild looked up at the sudden noise with an expression of profound interest. The second pregnancy was easier than the first. She was more confident in what to expect. Cyrus was less anxious, and the ranch was running well enough that she could delegate a little more freely. The baby came in January of 1886, another healthy child, this time a girl, who arrived with even more enthusiasm than her brother had, and with a full head of dark hair and dark eyes that were unquestionably her mother's. They named her Clara Margaret Fairchild, Clara after Ellen's mother, who had died of fever when Ellen was 14, Margaret after no one in particular, but because it was a name that sounded right. William, now 2 years old and extremely opinionated about most things, was presented with his sister with considerable ceremony, and reacted with a thorough and prolonged investigation, touching her nose and her fingers and her ears with a focused curiosity that Cyrus said reminded him exactly of William himself, examining a new fence post. Clara was a different baby than William had been, quieter, but watchful, with a quality of intense observation that both parents recognized as a trait that had come from somewhere, though they couldn't agree on which of them it most resembled. "She watches everything," Cyrus said one evening, holding her while she looked at the lamplight with those serious dark eyes. "So do you," Ellen said. "So do you," he replied. "We're both terrible gossips in our way," she said, and he laughed. And Clara continued watching the lamp with great concentration, and William was asleep in his small bed in the corner, and the fire was good, and the desert winter was cold against the adobe walls outside, and inside it was warm and full, so full, with the particular fullness of a life that has found its right shape. In the spring of 1886, they made one more significant improvement to the ranch, a real addition to the main house. A proper second bedroom for the children, built of adobe brick that Cyrus made himself over the winter in the traditional way he had learned from watching Miguel's old construction techniques, mixing caliche clay with straw and pressing it into wooden forms and letting it dry in the cold winter sun. He laid the bricks in April, and Ellen helped on the days when both children were napping. And by June the room was finished and plastered and whitewashed and furnished with the 2 small beds that Cyrus had built from timber he'd hauled from the lumber man in Roswell. The day they moved the children into the new room, William very excited about the importance of his new sleeping arrangements, Clara indifferent but peaceful. Cyrus and Ellen stood in the newly opened space of their own room, which felt, without the children's small presence in it, both quieter and more specifically theirs. "You built a good room," she said. "I had a good teacher," he said. "Old Isaac Crawford always said a wall you build yourself holds better than one you pay for because it has your attention in every brick." "That sounds like a man worth knowing," she said. "He was," Cyrus said. "I'll have to tell William about him someday. And Clara." Ellen looked at him, this man who had come to her gate 4 years ago with nothing and who stood now in the room they shared in the house they were expanding together, talking about passing on the names of the people who had taught him things, talking about the future with the easy certainty of a man who knew he had one. "You're happy," she said. It was not really a question. "I'm happy," he said. "I've been happy." He looked at her steadily. "You did that, you and this place and William and Clara, but mostly you, Ellen. You let me in. You asked for water," she said, "and you asked about the fence," he said, "and you never left," she said, "and I never left," he agreed. She crossed the room to him and put her arms around him, and he folded his around her, and they stood in the quiet of the new room in the June evening, and outside the children's voices were audible through the adobe wall, William narrating something to Clara with great authority, and the sound of them was the best sound she had ever heard. The summer of 1887 was the summer that Tomás Delgado fell in love with a young woman from a family that had recently homesteaded 20 miles south. A capable and sharp-eyed girl named Rosa who came with her family to the fall market and caught Tomás's complete attention. Ellen watched this development with a warm amusement and the particular authority of someone who had personal experience with unexpected love appearing in working clothes. "You should tell her," she told Tomás one afternoon, catching him staring wistfully in Rosa's direction across the cattle market. "I don't know how to start," he said. "Ask her if she needs help with something," Cyrus said from behind Ellen, deadpan. Ellen turned around to look at him. He was looking at her with his dark eyes warm and full of private laughter. "That's good advice," she said. "I have personal experience with its effectiveness," he said. Tomás, somewhat confused by this exchange, nevertheless took the advice, and by the end of the fall market he and Rosa had established the beginning of what would, over the following year, become a proper courtship. He came to Cyrus to ask for guidance at one point, as young men sometimes go to an older man they respect, and Cyrus talked to him simply and honestly about what he knew and had learned. And Ellen, overhearing from the kitchen, thought that whatever she had given Cyrus in these years, the land, the home, the children, the belonging, he had given her back in every form she could imagine, and more. The years that followed built on each other the way good years do, steadily, one into the next, each one adding something to what had come before. The herd grew. The east parcel proved its worth through several dry summers when the river dropped and the spring-fed troughs kept the cattle watered. Tomás married Rosa in 1888 and continued working the ranch, and Aurelio eventually retired to a quieter life, replaced by a pair of brothers who came up from the south with good references and solid skills. William grew into a boy of serious interest in everything around him, particularly the cattle, whom he studied with the focused intensity of his mother and the patience of his father, and who began to be genuinely useful around the ranch by the time he was 6. Not the manufactured usefulness of a child given a broom to make him feel included, but real usefulness, the kind that comes from paying attention. Clara grew into a girl who was quieter than her brother but no less present, who had her father's quality of seeing what needed doing and doing it without being told, and who would sit on the porch in the evenings and read from the school books Ellen had ordered from Santa Fe, with the steady absorption of someone who was going somewhere with all that information. Cyrus built them a bookshelf in the winter of 1889, a real one with 10 shelves, made from good pine lumber. Ellen filled it over the following 2 years with a determination that amused and moved him, ordering books from the catalog, trading with neighbors, occasionally accepting the well-worn volumes that traveling salesmen sometimes offered in lieu of cash. By 1891 the shelf was full, and she started a second stack on the floor beside it, and Cyrus began talking about building a second shelf. "You are turning this ranch house into a library," he said. "I am turning it into a home," she said. "These are not mutually exclusive. I would argue they're the same thing," he said. "Then we agree," she said, and handed him the latest order from the catalog, which included a complete set of natural history books for William's birthday, and a novel she had been wanting to read for 2 years, and a primer on astronomy that she had ordered for no clear reason, except that she had always wanted to know more about the stars. He looked at the order and raised his eyebrows at the astronomy primer. "I want to know what we're looking at," she said, gesturing at the great dark sky outside the window. He looked at the sky and then at her and said, "I'll build the second shelf in February." One September evening in 1891, 9 years after Cyrus Fairchild had come to the gate with nothing and everything after, they sat on the porch in their 2 chairs as the last of the summer light gave way to the deep blue of the desert dusk. William was inside reading. Clara had fallen asleep on the blanket she'd spread in the yard an hour ago, watching the first stars appear, and neither parent had moved her yet because she was peaceful and the evening was warm enough. The Pecos Valley spread out before them in the old, familiar beauty that neither of them had ever stopped seeing: the grass, the river thread, the distant mountains going dark against the sky, the smell of sage and warmed earth. 9 years ago this month, Ellen said. Cyrus was quiet for a moment. Give or take a week, he said. You looked terrible, she said. I was terrible, he said. I was about 4 miles from considerable trouble. You latched my gate, she said. Even then. My mother would have risen from her grave to haunt me if I'd left a gate unlatched, he said. She smiled. I owe your mother a debt. He reached across the space between the chairs and found her hand and held it, and she turned her palm up and held his hand back. What would you have done, she asked, if I hadn't offered the food, if I'd just given you the water and sent you on? He thought about it seriously, the way he thought about most things. Kept walking, he said. Probably made it to Fort Sumner eventually, picked up some piece of work, kept moving. He paused. Never found this. No, she said. No, he agreed. I would have kept walking and never known the shape of the thing I hadn't found. She looked at Clara sleeping in the yard, one arm thrown out, the way she slept when the air was warm, and at the last pale strip of light over the western hills, and at their land, 380 acres of hard-won New Mexico territory that she had broken herself against for years alone, and that they had grown together into something real and good and lasting. I'm glad I asked about the fence, she said. His hand tightened on hers. So am I, he said. Ellen, so am I. She leaned her head slightly toward him, and he moved his chair close enough that she could. And they sat like that in the dark as the stars came fully out. Those stars she now knew the names of from the astronomy book, which she had read cover to cover twice and discussed with Cyrus on evenings exactly like this one. The Milky Way was a white river above them, the same sky that had been over this valley for 10,000 years before either of them was born, and would be over it long after they were gone, but which was, in this moment, entirely and particularly theirs. Inside, William called something to Clara, not knowing she was asleep in the yard, and when no answer came, went to the window to look out, and saw his parents sitting in the dark holding hands under the stars, and pulled his head quietly back inside with the particular tact of a 9-year-old who understood more than he was given credit for. Later, when Clara had been carried inside sleepy and half protesting, and William had said good night in his serious, dignified way, and the house was quiet, and the fire was low, Ellen and Cyrus sat at the kitchen table with the last of the coffee, and the quiet that was theirs most completely when the children were asleep, the deep, particular quiet of two people who have built something real together and know it. I want to start putting money toward the children's education, she said. Proper schooling when they're older. There's a school in Lincoln that takes boarding students. William would go if there were good books and cattle nearby, he said. There are always cattle nearby, she said, and Lincoln has a library. He'd go, Cyrus agreed. Clara would go anywhere that let her be curious. She gets that from you, Ellen said. She gets it from you, he said. She gets it from both of us, she said, and I think she'll do something with it that we can't entirely predict. Good, he said. That's exactly what she should do. Ellen looked at him across the table, this man who had been a stranger at her gate, and was now so woven into the fabric of her life that she sometimes could not tell, in the easy working hours of a day, where her way of doing things ended and his began. She thought about the woman she had been before he came, capable and stubborn and genuinely managing, but carrying a loneliness she had been too proud to name. She thought about the ranch as it was now, the full herd, the solid fences, the spring-fed troughs, the children's room with its 2 small beds, the bookshelf, the second bookshelf that he was already planning in the way he planned things, quietly and with purpose, measuring the wall in his head. Cyrus, she said. He looked at her. I love you, she said. She said it plainly, the way she said everything important without decoration, but with the full weight of meaning behind it. He was quiet for a moment, in the way of a man who is not hurrying past something worth stopping for. I love you, Ellen, he said. I have loved you since about the 3rd day, when you brought lunch out to the fence line and didn't make a word about the fact that I was eating like a man who hadn't had a decent meal in a week. You hadn't, she said. No, he said. "And you just let me eat and didn't perform any charity at me, and that was the moment I thought, this is a woman worth knowing." "A woman worth knowing," she said with some amusement. "That's a modest assessment." "A woman worth everything," he said. "Is that better?" "That's better," she said. He reached across the table and took her hand and held it in both of his, those large calloused hands that had built and mended and tended so much of what they had together. And she covered his hands with her other hand, and felt the roughness of them and the warmth of them, and was glad of every mile he had walked that had brought him to her gate on that August afternoon in 1882. "More coffee," she said. "Yes," he said. "And then tell me about the stars again." "The winter ones are starting to come out. I saw Orion last night." She filled his cup and her own, and they moved to the porch, wrapped in the blanket she kept on the hook by the door, and she pointed up into the cold, clear dark and told him what she knew, and he listened the way he always listened, completely and with interest. And the Pecos Valley lay around them in the night, the land they had made theirs, the life they had built, the story that had started with a starving man and a fence that needed mending and a woman who had asked, simply and practically, whether he could help. He had helped, and then he had stayed. And in all the years that followed, through the bright seasons and the hard ones, through the children growing and the cattle market shifting, and the territory moving toward becoming a state, and the world outside slowly changing in ways neither of them could have predicted when they were young, through all of it, the ranch held, and the fences held, and the spring on the east parcel continued to water the herd through dry summers, and the bookshelf eventually required a third shelf and then a fourth. And William grew into a man who did indeed combine cattle and books in ways his parents found entirely appropriate. And Clara grew into a woman who did something that neither of them had fully predicted, which was to become a teacher in Lincoln, and to be very good at it, and to write letters home every week that made both her parents laugh and sometimes cry in the good way. And on the evenings when the sky was clear, which in the Pecos Valley was most evenings, Ellen and Cyrus sat on the porch in their two chairs that had long since been replaced, but were always, essentially, the same two chairs, and held hands in the dark, and looked at the stars whose names they both knew now, and were grateful in the quiet, thorough way of people who have earned everything they have for all of it, every last piece of it.